A poor boy kindly paid for a homeless man's bus fare. A few days after the boy's accident, while his father was suffering from lack of money, suddenly, something appeared in front of their house. The morning light slipped through the cracks in the window, painting soft golden streaks across the wooden floor. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and something warm, perhaps the remnants of last night's dinner, still lingering in the tiny kitchen. Outside, the distant rumble of passing trucks and the rhythmic clatter of construction echoed through the neighborhood, a sound so familiar that it had become the backdrop of their daily lives. At the small wooden table, Andy swung his legs beneath the chair, waiting for the kettle to whistle. His father, Thomas, stood by the stove, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, his work boots already laced. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had long learned to make the most of his mornings, every action measured, every second accounted for. "Can I pour it today?" Andy asked, leaning forward, eyes fixed on the steaming kettle. Thomas exhaled a quiet chuckle, wiping his hands on the towel slung over his shoulder. "It's just hot water, son. Nothing fancy. But you always say a good cup of tea makes a man ready for the day. I want to make yours perfect." Thomas looked down at his son, the eagerness in his face so genuine that it pulled a tired smile from him. He took a step back, giving Andy space at the counter. "All right then, Mr. Tea Master. Show me what you got." Andy carefully lifted the kettle, his small hands steady as he poured the hot water over the tea leaves. The earthy scent rose instantly, curling into the air like a quiet kind of comfort. He waited, watching as the color deepened, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Patience," Thomas murmured. "That's the secret. Let it sit a moment. Let it become what it's meant to be." Andy nodded, as if committing the lesson to memory, before setting the kettle back with a proud grin. "I think it's ready now." Thomas took a sip, his expression unreadable at first. Then he gave a slow nod. "Not bad. Maybe a little strong, but strong isn't always a bad thing." He ruffled Andy's hair before taking another sip. "You did good, son." Andy beamed, his small chest puffing with pride. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the sound filling the quiet as they finished their tea. Thomas glanced at it, then at his son, a familiar crease forming between his brows. "Listen, Andy, I might be home a little late today. There's a new site opening up and the boss needs extra hands." Andy's face fell just a little, but he masked it quickly, forcing a nod. "That's okay. I can help around here." Thomas studied him for a moment, then crouched to Andy's level, resting a heavy hand on his shoulder. "I know it isn't always easy, but you understand, don't you? Work puts food on the table, keeps the roof over our heads." "I know," Andy said softly. "You work hard for us. And you take care of things here. That's just as important." Andy's fingers curled around the hem of his shirt, eyes flickering toward the small pile of battered schoolbooks on the shelf. "I just wish I could do more." Thomas smiled, though there was a weight behind it. "You do enough, son. More than you know." He stood, draining the last of his tea before grabbing his worn-out jacket. "Now, you be good today. And remember what I always say. A good heart is stronger than anything money can buy," Andy recited instantly. "That's right." Thomas pressed a quick kiss to the top of his son's head before grabbing his lunch pail and heading toward the door. Andy watched as his father stepped onto the cracked pavement, his shadow stretching long against the morning light. The front door clicked shut, and suddenly the house felt bigger, emptier. He let out a slow breath and glanced around the room. The dishes needed washing. The floor could use a sweep. His schoolwork was still waiting too. But first, he went to the window, watching as his father disappeared down the street toward the construction site, his silhouette swallowed by the early bustle of the city. Andy didn't wish for riches, didn't dream of fancy houses or new clothes. He just wished, one day, he could make life easier for his father. And that night, as he knelt beside his bed, hands folded together, He whispered the only prayer he ever truly cared for. Not for money, Lord. Not for big things. Just let me be good. Let me be strong. Let me be kind. Just like my dad. The wind hummed outside the window, carrying his words into the quiet. And somewhere beyond the city, beyond the streets and the rising steel structures, the universe listened. The scent of rain still clung to the morning air, dampening the rooftops and settling into the cracks of the pavement outside. The distant sounds of the city waking up, muffled horns, hurried footsteps, the occasional clatter of a shop gate being pulled open, filtered in through the thin walls of their small home. Inside, the quiet was warm, the kind of quiet that wrapped around a home before the day fully began. Thomas sat at the edge of the kitchen table, rolling a crisp $5 bill between his fingers. It wasn't much. God knew it wasn't much, but in his hands it felt heavier than it should have. Not in weight, but in meaning. He glanced at the small sleeping form curled beneath a patchwork blanket on the worn-out couch. Andy, his son, his boy, who never asked for more than what was given, who never pouted when other kids had shinier things, who never complained even when his shoes had more patches than leather. Thomas exhaled slowly, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. Today, though, he could give his boy something extra. A small gift, not out of necessity, not for school, not to fix something, but just because. A rare moment of joy. He stood, moving toward the couch, crouching down until he was level with Andy's peaceful face. His son's breath was slow, even, his lashes resting against his cheeks, in that deep, trusting sleep that only children seemed capable of. "Hey, bud," Thomas whispered, nudging his shoulder gently. Andy stirred, mumbling something unintelligible before his eyes cracked open, still fogged with sleep. "Morning already?" His voice was thick, his small fingers rubbing at his eyes. Thomas grinned. "Morning already. And guess what?" He held out the $5 bill, watching as Andy blinked at it in confusion before realization dawned. "For me." Andy sat up quickly, his sleepiness dissolving. "For you." Andy hesitated before reaching out, almost like he had to be sure this wasn't some dream that would vanish the moment he touched it. The paper crinkled between his fingers, real and solid. He turned it over, inspecting it as if he had never seen money before. "I can buy anything I want?" he asked, his voice carrying both excitement and disbelief. Thomas chuckled, ruffling his son's already messy hair. "Anything you want, kiddo." "It's yours." Andy grinned, the kind of grin that made all of Thomas's exhaustion worth it. "I know exactly what I'm getting." Thomas laughed. "Let me guess. A mountain of donuts." "Not a mountain," Andy said, slipping off the couch and stretching his arms above his head. "Just enough for me and you." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest, an ache that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with love. Even when given the chance to be selfish, Andy always thought of others. "Well, aren't I lucky?" he said, reaching for his jacket. "Come on, I'll walk you to the bus stop." Andy clutched the bill tightly in his hand as he stepped onto the bus, careful not to wrinkle it. The bus was already half full. Men in stiff work uniforms, mothers with tired eyes, students with heavy backpacks. No one looked at each other. No one spoke. He took a seat near the window, pressing his forehead against the glass. Outside, the city rushed past in smudges of color. Brick buildings, streetlights, shop signs flashing open in neon letters. He imagined the warm, golden donuts waiting for him at the bakery, the way they would melt in his mouth, the way his dad would hum in satisfaction as he took a bite. Just the thought of it made him smile. The bus lurched to a stop. At first, Andy didn't notice anything unusual. Just the usual shuffle of people boarding, the impatient sighs of those forced to move to make space. Then, a voice, desperate, hoarse. "Please, sir, just let me ride. I don't have any money, but I just need to get across town. Please." Andy turned, his fingers tightening around his money. A man stood at the front of the bus, his clothes stained, his hair wild and unkempt, his bare feet dirty against the cold metal floor. His hands trembled at his sides, his eyes darting between the driver and the passengers, as if searching for an ounce of mercy. The driver frowned, unimpressed. "You need a fare, pal, just like everyone else." I know, the man said quickly, nodding. I lost my wallet, and I don't have anyone to help me right now. Please, I just need to get to the other side of the city." Silence. The kind of silence that felt heavier than noise, the kind that stretched and stretched until it became unbearable. The passengers looked away, some out the window, some at their phones, some just pretending to be asleep. Andy felt something shift in his chest. The man turned desperately toward the crowd. "Anyone? Please. I swear I'll pay it back. I just need—" The driver crossed his arms. "Look, buddy, I've got a schedule to keep. No money, no ride. You got to get off." The man swallowed, his shoulders curling inward, his hands gripping the fabric of his torn shirt. Andy's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He looked down at his $5 bill, the one thing his dad had given him, just for him. The man took a slow step backward, his face twisting with something Andy recognized too well. Defeat. "Please step off," the driver repeated, reaching for the lever to open the doors. A sharp sigh cut through the heavy silence. "For God's sake," a man muttered from the middle of the bus, "if you don't have money, walk like the rest of us." A woman beside him scoffed. "Every day it's something. First, they beg outside stores. Now they want free rides. We're all struggling. Why should we pay for someone else?" Another voice, gruff and impatient, grumbled, "We're wasting time. Just get him off already." The driver exhaled sharply and raised his voice. "You heard them, buddy. Get off my bus. I don't have time for this." The man flinched, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I'm just trying to get to the other side of town. I swear, I don't care." The driver cut in, already reaching for the door lever. Andy watched, his heart hammering against his ribs. His fingers dug into the edges of his $5 bill, crumpling it slightly. He thought about the donuts. He thought about the way his dad had smiled when he'd handed him the money. And then he thought about something else. About how his dad always said kindness was the strongest thing a man could carry. Before he could talk himself out of it, Andy stood. "I'll pay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words barely reached the front. He forced himself to speak louder. "I'll pay his fare." The bus fell into a deeper silence, as if even the hum of the engine had dulled to listen. The driver blinked, surprised. A few passengers turned in their seats, some shaking their heads, some whispering under their breath. Andy walked toward the front, his small hand trembling as he held out the crumpled bill. The $5 note, warm from his palm, felt lighter than it had that morning. The driver hesitated for a second, then snatched it from his hand with a grunt. "Fine, but next time he needs to have his own money." He punched the ticket and gestured for the man to sit down. Andy turned to him, the ragged man with dirt-streaked skin and hollow eyes. Up close, the exhaustion on his face was clearer, the kind that seeped into the bones and made a man feel smaller in the world. The man stared at him, as if unsure whether to accept. "You're a kid. You didn't have to do that," he murmured. "I know," Andy said simply. The man hesitated a second longer before nodding, lowering himself into the empty seat beside him. Andy sat back down too, feeling the weight of the stares around him. He could hear the whispers, the quiet judgment, the soft scoffs. "Stupid kid. Wasted money. He'll just ask again tomorrow." But Andy didn't care. The man beside him sat stiffly at first, his fingers twitching against his pants. Then, after a moment, he turned to Andy, studying him with an intensity that made Andy shift slightly in his seat. "You're not like most people," the man finally said. Andy shrugged, his gaze flicking back out the window. "My dad says a good heart is the strongest thing a person can have." The man was quiet for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he exhaled a breath that was almost a laugh, shaking his head slightly. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he muttered. Andy glanced at him. "Who?" The man didn't answer right away. He stared at his hands, rubbing his thumb over the rough skin of his palm. "Someone I wish I hadn't let down," he said finally. Andy wasn't sure what to say to that, so he just nodded. The ride continued, the bus rocking gently over the uneven streets. The voices of the passengers faded into background noise. Finally, as the bus slowed near Andy's stop, the man turned to him again. His fingers twitched, as if he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. Then, in a sudden movement, he reached for Andy's hand, gripping it tightly between his own. His palms were calloused, rougher than his father's, but the hold was steady. "One day," the man said, his voice low but firm, "I will repay you." Andy blinked, caught off guard. "You don't have to," he said automatically. The man only smiled, small, tired, but something in his eyes looked different now, less hollow. The bus jerked to a stop. Andy stood, stepping down onto the pavement. The doors hissed shut behind him. He didn't turn back, didn't watch as the bus pulled away. He simply exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. His $5 were gone. There would be no donuts today. But as he walked home, something about the city air felt different, lighter. And Andy, despite everything, smiled. The warm scent of freshly baked bread drifted from the corner bakery, mixing with the crisp autumn air. Andy stood outside the glass display case, his breath fogging up the surface as he pressed his nose closer. The golden brown donuts sat in neat rows, each one glistening under the soft glow of the shop's lights. He dug into his pocket, fingers brushing against the $1 bill he had left. "One, please," he said, his voice small but certain. The woman behind the counter gave him a kind smile, sliding the donut into a small brown paper bag. "Treating yourself today?" Andy shook his head as he handed over the money. "It's for me and my dad." She hesitated for half a second before nodding, her eyes softening. "That's a good heart you've got, kid." Andy just smiled, clutching the bag tightly as he stepped back outside. The streets were waking up now, workers rushing toward the bus stops, children in school uniforms walking in groups, their voices carrying in the morning air. But Andy paid little attention. He was thinking about his dad. By the time he reached home, Thomas was already at the kitchen table, his head resting in one hand, a newspaper spread out in front of him. He looked up as Andy entered, eyes still heavy with exhaustion. "You're up early," Thomas said, straightening as Andy slid into the chair across from him. "I got us something." Andy placed the paper bag between them and pulled out the donut, breaking it in half. "Here." Thomas hesitated. "Kiddo, "No excuses," Andy cut in, pushing the bigger half toward his father. "You worked late. You barely ate dinner." A slow smile stretched across Thomas's face. "You really are something, you know that?" He picked up the donut, taking a small bite. "And I was afraid you were going to buy the whole donut shop." Andy chewed thoughtfully before swallowing. "I had some left." Thomas frowned slightly. "Left? From the money I gave?" Andy hesitated for only a second. Then, he told him, about the man on the bus, about the way people had looked away, about how it hadn't felt right to ignore someone who needed help. Thomas listened without interrupting, his calloused hands resting on the table, his coffee going cold. When Andy finished, there was a long silence. Then, Thomas reached across the table and squeezed his son's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Andy." Andy's chest felt warm at those words, like something inside him had settled in the right place. But as days passed, the warmth of that moment was slowly replaced by something heavier. Thomas's job at the construction site was becoming more demanding. The work was hard enough on normal days, but now, with deadlines tightening, the pressure was unbearable. The boss, an impatient, sharp-eyed man named Mr. Griffin, kept pushing the workers, demanding longer hours and quicker results. "They're running us into the ground," Thomas muttered one evening as he unlaced his boots by the door. His shoulders sagged, his arms covered in fine dust. "Half the guys are getting hurt trying to keep up." Andy sat on the couch, watching his father rub his temples. "Can't they slow down?" Thomas scoffed. "Slow down? Griffin only cares about finishing ahead of schedule. Doesn't matter if someone collapses in the process." Andy didn't like the sound of that. He didn't like the way his father winced when he stretched his back, or how his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his glass of water. More and more, Andy started waiting for Thomas at the construction site. He would sit near the gates, watching as men in faded shirts and worn-out boots moved like machines, lifting, hammering, and hauling. And he saw how hard it was. The sun beat down on them in the afternoons, sweat soaking their collars. Dust clung to their clothes, their skin. No one stopped to rest for long, not when the foreman kept barking orders. Sometimes Thomas would glance toward the gate and spot Andy watching. He'd give him a tired smile and a little wave before getting back to work. But Andy could see it, the exhaustion that no smile could hide. Still, even in those long, difficult days, they found moments of happiness. After dinner, they'd sit on the small balcony, the city stretched out before them. The sky, dark and endless, was dotted with faint stars. Thomas leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs. "Do you think stars have names?" Andy tilted his head, thinking. "Probably. Maybe someone named them a long time ago." Thomas hummed. "What would you name one?" Andy squinted at the brightest one he could find. "That one looks like a hammer. I'd call it—" He paused. "The Builder's Star." Thomas chuckled. "A star for working men, huh?" Andy nodded. "For the strongest one I know." Thomas went quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and messed up Andy's hair. "You sure know how to make a guy feel important, kid." And just like that, the heaviness of the day didn't feel so heavy anymore. They played chess at the kitchen table, Thomas grumbling every time Andy stole one of his pieces. They shared late-night stories, whispering so the neighbors wouldn't hear through the thin walls. And every night, before he closed his eyes, Andy sent up a small, silent prayer. "Keep my dad safe." It was all he ever wanted. The air smelled of sawdust and sweat, thick with the metallic tang of steel and concrete. The rhythmic pounding of hammers echoed through the construction site, blending with the occasional barked orders from the foreman. Andy stood near the entrance, his small hands gripping the rusted gate as he scanned the site for his father. He wanted to wait for his dad to get off work. The evening sun cast long shadows across the half-built structure, the skeletal beams stretching high above the workers who moved like ants, pushing through their exhaustion to keep up with the relentless pace. He spotted Thomas near the scaffolding, his shirt damp with sweat, his movements steady despite the fatigue weighing on his shoulders. Andy smiled. He always found comfort in seeing his father work, his careful precision, the quiet pride in every measured movement. But today, something felt different. The workers were moving faster, their gestures hurried, their faces lined with silent strain. A shout broke through the air. "Pick it up! We don't have all night!" Mr. Griffin's voice rang through the site, sharp and impatient. He stood near the office trailer, arms crossed, watching the men like a hawk. Andy didn't like him. He didn't like the way he never lifted a finger to help, how he only ever spoke in commands. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, waiting for his father to notice him. He was supposed to stand outside the gate, but today he just wanted to be closer, just a little closer. The scaffolding above groaned. Andy's eyes flickered up, The wooden planks trembled under the weight of the workers scrambling to finish their task. Something looked wrong. Then, it happened. A sharp crack, like a bone snapping. A scream. The scaffolding buckled, and then, before Andy could move, before he could think, it collapsed. The world tilted. Wood splintered, metal screeched, and dust exploded into the air like a thick fog. Andy didn't hear the impact. Not really. Not over the deafening roar in his ears, the crushing weight against his body, the panic clawing up his throat. Pain. Blinding, unbearable pain. He tried to move. He couldn't. His legs were trapped. The world was spinning, darkening, pulling him under. Somewhere through the haze, voices blurred together. "Get him out!" "Jesus Christ, it's a kid. Call an ambulance now!" The rubble shifted, hands digging through the wreckage. And then, "Andy!" His father's voice. Thomas was there, tearing through the debris like a madman, his hands bleeding, shaking as he reached for his son. His breath was ragged, his face a mask of horror. "Stay with me, son," Thomas choked out, his fingers gripping Andy's arms, his voice breaking. "I'm right here. I got you. I got you." Andy's lips parted, but no words came out. His body felt weightless, detached from the pain, from everything. Sirens wailed in the distance. And then, darkness. The first thing he noticed was the beeping, a steady rhythmic sound that pulsed through the silence. Andy's eyelids felt heavy. When he finally managed to open them, everything was white. The ceiling, the sheets, the bandages were wrapped around his arms. He tried to move, but pain shot through his body like fire, forcing him still. "Hey, buddy," his father's voice. Andy turned his head slowly. Thomas sat by the hospital bed, his face unshaven, his eyes hollowed out with exhaustion. His hands were clasped together like he was praying. Andy swallowed, his throat dry. "What happened?" Thomas let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "The scaffolding collapsed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You got caught under it." Andy blinked. The memory came back in flashes. Dust, shouting, pain, and then, "My legs," he said suddenly, his voice sharp with fear. "Dad, I can't." His father reached for him immediately. Hey, don't panic." His voice was soothing, but his eyes gave him away. Andy's breath came faster. He tried again, tried to move his legs, but there was nothing, no sensation. Terror seized his chest. "Dad," he gasped, his voice cracking. Thomas squeezed his hand hard. "The doctors are doing everything they can, son." But his throat bobbed. He forced himself to continue. "They said, if you don't respond to treatment, you might not be able to walk again." Andy's world stopped. The beeping of the monitors, the quiet hum of the hospital outside the room, the weight of his father's words. He might never walk again. He stared at the ceiling, blinking back the sting in his eyes. His hands clenched into fists, gripping the sheets so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Thomas sat in the office across from Mr. Griffin, his hands curled into tight fists on his lap. "I'm sorry about your son," Griffin said, not sounding sorry at all. "But he wasn't a worker on site. The company isn't responsible." Thomas's jaw tightened. "He was there to see me, and your site wasn't safe." "We follow owed regulations," Griffin interrupted. "Since he wasn't employed and entered the construction site without permission, we can't be held liable." A check slid across the desk. Thomas stared at it. It was barely enough to cover a fraction of the hospital bills. His fists trembled. "This is a joke," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "It's the best we can do." Griffin leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Take it or leave it." Thomas saw red. He wanted to lunge across the desk, grab Griffin by the collar, and make him feel even a fraction of what Andy had suffered. But he didn't, because he didn't have a choice. With shaking hands, He took the check, and then he left. That night, Thomas sat by Andy's bedside, exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight he could no longer carry. His boy, his bright, smiling boy, lay there motionless, his legs wrapped in bandages, his future uncertain. And there was nothing he could do, except work, more hours, more jobs, whatever it took, even if it killed him, because he would save his son, no matter what it costs. The city moved on as if nothing had changed. People hurried down the streets, cars honked impatiently, and neon signs flickered against the evening sky. But for Thomas, the world had slowed to a painful crawl. His home was quieter than ever. The space that once echoed with Andy's laughter now felt hollow. There were no more chess games, no more late-night talks under the stars. Just the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the relentless weight of worry pressing on his chest. The only sound that broke the silence was a gentle knock on the door. Thomas rubbed his tired eyes before opening it. Standing there, holding a pot wrapped in a dish towel, was Teresa, the elderly woman from next door. Her face, lined with age, was softened by kindness. "I heard about Andy," she said, her voice gentle. "I figured you hadn't been eating much, so I made some soup." Thomas opened his mouth to protest, but she shook her head. "Don't start with the pride, dear. You'll need your strength." He swallowed the lump in his throat and stepped aside. "Come in, Teresa." She moved through the kitchen with ease, placing the pot on the stove before ladling some soup into a bowl. The aroma of chicken and herbs filled the space, reminding Thomas how long it had been since he'd had a real meal. He took a seat at the table, staring at the bowl. "I should be at the hospital." "You should eat," Teresa corrected, sitting across from him. "Andy needs you strong, not falling apart." Thomas sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know how to fix this." Teresa reached out, her wrinkled hand covering his. "Some things aren't meant to be fixed by our hands alone, Thomas." He looked up, meeting her knowing gaze. "Have you prayed?" she asked softly. Thomas hesitated. It had been a long time since he'd stepped inside a church, since he'd truly spoken to God. He wasn't even sure if he knew how to anymore. Teresa gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "Go. The Lord listens, even when we don't have the right words." The small church stood on the corner of the neighborhood, its stained glass windows glowing under the streetlights. Thomas pushed open the heavy wooden doors, stepping inside. The air smelled of old wood and melted candle wax. It was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the pews and the flickering flames of the votive candles. He walked down the aisle, his boots echoing against the stone floor, before lowering himself onto a pew. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the altar, his hands curled together, rough from years of labor, fingers twisting against each other. Then, slowly, he bowed his head. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice hoarse. The silence stretched around him, thick and heavy. Thomas swallowed hard. "I've always tried to take care of things myself, to work harder when things got tough, to do whatever it takes to keep my son safe." His breath trembled. "But I can't fix this." His shoulders shook as he closed his eyes. "Please, just let him walk again. Let him be happy again." A tear slipped down his face, disappearing into the worn fabric of his shirt. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt helpless. And so, for the first time in a long time, he let go. The walls of the hospital were too white, too clean, too quiet. Andy stared at the ceiling, tracing invisible patterns in the tiles above him. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled his nose, a constant reminder of where he was, of what had happened. He tried not to think about it, tried not to think about the weight of the blankets pressing against his legs, about how he couldn't feel them, about the way the doctors spoke in hushed voices when they checked his charts, or how the nurses gave him that look, the look of pity. He hated it, hated the beeping of the monitors, hated the way the light flickered in the hallway, hated the ache in his father's voice whenever he whispered, "How are you feeling, bud?" Andy always answered the same way, "I'm okay, Dad." But he wasn't. Thomas was drowning. He moved like a man in a daze, dragging himself from job to job, barely sleeping, barely eating. If there was work, he took it. Morning shifts, night shifts, anything that paid, even just a little. The hospital bills stacked higher. The doctors' voices grew colder. The word treatment was always followed by cost. Andy never asked about the money, but Thomas knew he was old enough to understand. He could see it in his son's eyes. One evening, after yet another long shift, Thomas walked into Andy's hospital room, his body heavy with exhaustion. Andy was awake, staring at the window, watching the faint glow of city lights outside. Thomas forced a smile. "You should be sleeping, kiddo." Andy turned his head. "Couldn't." Thomas sighed, sinking into the chair beside the bed. His muscles ached from the endless hours at the factory, from lifting, hauling, bending, and never stopping. Andy studied him. His father looked different. His usual strength seemed thinner, worn down like an old rope ready to snap. "You look tired," Andy murmured. Thomas chuckled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, well, work's been busy." Andy hesitated, then said, "You don't have to stay all night. You need rest, too." Thomas's throat tightened. Rest? How could he rest when his son might never walk again? He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "It's fine, bud. I want to be here." Silence stretched between them. Andy fidgeted with the edge of the blanket. "I miss home," he admitted softly. Thomas swallowed hard. "I know, son." "I miss our chess games," Andy said. "I miss the balcony at night. I miss just being able to move." His voice cracked at the last word. Thomas looked at his son, the boy who had always been full of light, full of life, now trapped in this sterile room, in this unmoving body. A lump rose in his throat. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "I failed you." Andy's chest ached at those words. He reached out, his small fingers finding his father's rough, calloused hand. "You didn't fail me, Dad," he whispered back. "We'll get through this." Thomas looked at him, searching his son's face for something, maybe anger, maybe resentment. But all he saw was faith. And it shattered him. For the first time since the accident, Thomas let himself break. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against his son's hand, his shoulders shaking. He had no idea how to fix this, no idea how to save his son. But Andy believed in him, and that had to be enough, for now. The early morning air was still, the kind of silence that hung heavy before the world fully stirred. The soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a stray dog were the only sounds breaking through the quiet. Inside the tiny home, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, rubbing a hand over his tired face. The untouched cup of coffee in front of him had gone cold hours ago. His body ached from too many shifts, too many sleepless nights. But none of it mattered. Only Andy mattered. He was about to rise and prepare for another grueling day, when a sound cut through the morning stillness. A low rumble, deep and commanding, growing louder by the second. It wasn't the usual sound of an old pickup rattling down the street or the muffled footsteps of their neighbors heading to work. This was different. Thomas frowned and walked toward the window. What he saw made him freeze. A convoy of sleek, black luxury cars had come to a stop outside his house, their polished surfaces gleaming under the faint morning light. His pulse quickened. What the hell was going on? Before he could step outside, the doorbell rang. Thomas opened the door cautiously. Standing before him was a man, elegant, composed, and entirely unfamiliar at first glance. His tailored suit sat perfectly against his lean frame, his polished shoes untouched by the dusty pavement. But it wasn't his wealth that unsettled Thomas. It was his face. He knew this man. And yet, he didn't. Edward. The same desperate figure Andy had helped that day on the bus, but now transformed. Clean-shaven, confident, a presence that commanded the space around him. Thomas tightened his grip on the doorknob. "Can I help you?" Edward gave a small, knowing smile. "I believe I owe you an explanation." They sat in the cramped living room, the contrast between Edward's polished presence and the worn-out furniture almost surreal. Thomas leaned forward, hands clasped together, studying the man across from him. "I know this is unexpected," Edward began, his voice smooth yet sincere, "but I need you to understand something before we go any further." Thomas exhaled slowly. "Go on." Edward rested his elbows on his knees, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "That day on the bus, when Andy helped me, I wasn't just some homeless man." Thomas stiffened but said nothing. Edward continued. "I had been kidnapped." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Thomas frowned. "What?" Edward nodded. "I come from a different world than yours. A world where power and money attract danger." His jaw tightened slightly. "A group of men took me, held me for ransom. They stripped me of everything. My name, my identity, my freedom." His gaze flickered toward the window, as if remembering something distant. "I barely managed to escape. I had nothing. No phone, no wallet, no way to prove who I was. And that night, when I ran onto that bus, I was nothing more than a man begging for mercy." He paused, his expression unreadable. "And the only person who showed me kindness was your son." Thomas swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. Edward leaned forward slightly. "I've thought about that moment every single day since. About how a little boy, with nothing to his name but $5 and a good heart, was the only one who stepped forward when no one else would." His voice softened. "Andy didn't just help me that night. He saved me. Because of him, I made it home. I got my life back." Thomas clenched his jaw, his emotions warring inside him. He thought of Andy in that hospital bed, his legs still motionless beneath the sheets. He thought of the bills piling up, of the way the world had turned its back on them when they needed help the most. And now, here was this man, a stranger in everything but name, telling him he had been saved by his son. Thomas cleared his throat. "Why are you here?" Edward met his gaze, unwavering. "Because now it's my turn to help you." Silence stretched between them. Then, Edward reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, placing it carefully on the table. "I have the best doctors in the country on standby, specialists who have spent their careers doing the impossible. If there's even the slightest chance of Andy walking again, they'll find it." Thomas stared at the papers, his breath unsteady. Edward wasn't done. "And I want to ensure Andy has every opportunity life can offer, the best care, the best education, whatever he needs. No more struggling, no more worrying about bills. This isn't charity, Thomas." His voice was firm. "This is repaying a debt." Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. His pride fought against the idea of accepting help, but then he thought of Andy, of the quiet pain in his son's eyes. This wasn't about him. It never had been. He exhaled shakily and nodded. Edward extended a hand. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before shaking it, and just like that, the tide began to turn. The cold sterility of the hospital room made Andy's skin prickle. His fingers gripped the blanket pulled over his lap, his knuckles turning white. He had never been afraid of hospitals before, never had to be. But now, everything felt different. His heart pounded as the doctors prepared him for surgery, their voices calm, yet distant, like an echo. Machines beeped softly in the background, and the faint smell of antiseptic clung to the air. Edward was beside him, his presence steady and reassuring. "You okay, kid?" Edward asked gently. Andy nodded, but his eyes stung. His throat tightened. He wasn't okay. He was terrified. Edward seemed to understand. He reached out, placing a firm but gentle hand on Andy's shoulder. "You're strong, Andy. Braver than most men I know." Andy blinked rapidly, fighting against the tears that threatened to spill over. He turned his head toward Edward. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "For what?" "For everything," Andy said, swallowing hard. "For not forgetting me." Edward's grip tightened just slightly before he let go. "Never." Thomas appeared on the other side of the bed, his face drawn with worry. He smoothed Andy's hair back, his fingers rough but careful. "I love you, bud," he murmured. Andy gave a shaky smile. "Love you too, Dad." Then, before he could say anything else, the anesthesia took over, and the world faded into darkness. The surgery lasted hours, too many hours. Thomas paced the waiting room, his arms crossed over his chest, his fingers gripping his own elbows so tightly they ached. Edward sat nearby, unusually quiet, his sharp gaze fixed on the floor. Neither man spoke, neither could. It was the longest wait of Thomas's life. Finally, the door swung open. A doctor stepped in, his expression unreadable. Thomas froze, his breath caught in his chest. "Well?" The doctor gave a slow nod. "The surgery went as planned. Now, we wait." Relief crashed over Thomas so suddenly that he had to sit down. His legs felt weak. Hope felt dangerous. Edward exhaled beside him. "He's got the best team working with him," he reassured. "We'll take it one step at a time." Thomas nodded, barely able to believe any of this was real. One step at a time. Recovery was brutal, painful, slow, frustrating. There were days Andy wanted to scream, days when his body felt like a cage he was trapped inside. The therapy sessions stretched endlessly, every small movement costing him every ounce of strength he had. But Edward was always there. "You're going to hate this," he had warned the first day Andy started therapy. Andy had only scowled. "I already do." Edward smirked. "Good. That means you're doing it right." At first, nothing changed. His legs remained unresponsive. The hours of therapy felt pointless, the effort agonizing. But Edward never let him quit. When the exercises became unbearable, Edward talked to him, really talked to him. "I used to think money would solve everything," Edward admitted one afternoon, as Andy struggled through another session. "That if I just worked hard enough, climbed high enough, I'd be untouchable. But life doesn't work that way." Andy, breathless and exhausted, gritted his teeth as he pushed against the resistance bands. "What happened?" Edward leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "I lost everything, more than once. The first time it was my own fault, bad choices, bad people. The second time," his jaw tensed, "that was when I was kidnapped." Andy looked at him. "Did you ever want to give up?" Edward smiled, though it was small and tired. "Every day, but I didn't." He knelt beside Andy's chair. "And neither will you." Thomas, no longer drowning in relentless shifts, finally had time. Thanks to Edward, he had a new job, safe, stable, and enough. He spent his evenings at the hospital, holding Andy's hand, telling him stories, bringing him the warmth of home. "I'll take over for tonight," Thomas told Edward one evening, pulling a chair beside Andy's bed. Edward stretched, standing. "All right, but if he complains too much, call me." Andy groaned. "I hate you both." Edward smirked. "That's the spirit." As Edward left, Thomas looked at his son. "You know," he said, "I think I liked it better when I was the only one you insulted." Andy gave a breathless laugh. "Sorry, Dad. You'll have to share the suffering now." Thomas smiled, a real, genuine smile. It had been too long. And then, the breakthrough came. It was just a twitch, a flicker of movement in his toe, so small, so fleeting that Andy almost didn't believe it. But when he saw the look on his therapist's face, he knew. "Andy," she breathed, eyes wide. "Do that again." Andy focused. He clenched his jaw, sweat beading on his forehead, and his toe moved. His heart slammed against his ribs. He felt it. He turned to the therapist. "I can feel it." Tears filled her eyes. "We're getting somewhere, kid." Andy's hands clenched into fists. Somewhere. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time since the accident, he believed he would walk again. The sound of crutches against the tiled hospital floor echoed softly in the hallway. Andy took another step, his arms trembling as he gripped the handles tightly. His breathing was labored, his body aching, but he was moving. One step, then another. His physical therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patel, watched him with careful eyes. "That's it, Andy," she encouraged. "Steady. Take your time." Andy clenched his jaw, focusing on the next step. It wasn't easy. It felt like his legs were waking up from a deep sleep, weak, shaky, unfamiliar. But every small movement reminded him that he was fighting his way back. Thomas stood near the doorway, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He didn't dare breathe. And then, it happened. Andy took a step, then another. And suddenly, he wasn't falling. Tears welled up in Thomas's eyes. He took a slow, shaky breath, overwhelmed by the sight of his son standing on his own 2 feet. Edward, leaning casually against the wall, smirked. "Told you, kid. No quitting." Andy huffed, exhausted, but smiling. "You're annoying," Edward chuckled. "Yeah, but I'm right." Dr. Patel clapped her hands together. "Andy, this is incredible progress. If you keep pushing yourself, you'll be walking without support soon." Andy grinned, for the first time in a long time, feeling hopeful about his future. The day Andy left the hospital, it felt surreal. Edward had arranged for a driver, and as the car pulled up to their home, Andy stared at the familiar sight of their tiny house. He hadn't been back since the accident. Thomas helped him inside, and Andy took slow steps, his crutches digging into the worn wooden floor. Everything felt smaller. Or maybe he had just changed. That night, they sat on the small balcony, looking up at the stars, just like they used to. "You did it, bud," Thomas said softly. Andy leaned against the railing, staring at the sky. "Not yet, but I will." Thomas smiled, pride shining in his tired eyes. "Yeah, you will." A month later, Edward made another surprise visit. "How would you feel about going back to school?" he asked one morning over breakfast. Andy hesitated, his spoon hovering over his cereal. "I don't know." "You're ready," Edward said, watching him closely. "And not just any school. I've arranged for you to attend Brookshire Academy. Best teachers, best facilities." Andy blinked. "Wait, the Brookshire Academy?" Edward nodded. Andy's stomach twisted. He knew about that school. It was for rich kids, kids whose parents were CEOs, politicians, celebrities, not kids like him. He hesitated. "I don't belong there." Edward leaned forward, his expression serious. "Listen to me, Andy. You belong anywhere you want to be. You earned this." Thomas, sitting across the table, placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You can do this, bud." Andy swallowed hard, uncertainty gnawing at him. But then he thought about everything he had fought for. He had learned to walk again. He could learn to face this too. The first day at Brookshire Academy was overwhelming. The school was massive, its brick walls towering above him. The halls were filled with students dressed in pressed uniforms, their conversations easy, confident. Andy adjusted the straps on his backpack, his palms damp with sweat. He could feel the stares. "Who's the new kid?" "Did you hear? He's here on a scholarship." "I heard he was in an accident or something." Andy squared his shoulders. He had been through worse than whispers. He walked toward his first class, head held high. Edward had given him a new chance at life, and he wasn't going to waste it. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day. Andy sat on the small balcony, his math book open on his lap, but his gaze drifted beyond the pages. The school day had been long. Too many curious stares, too many hushed whispers. He had expected it, but that didn't make it any easier. A light knock on the railing made him glance up. Edward stood there, a knowing look in his eyes. "Mind if I join you?" Andy shrugged. "It's your balcony too." Edward chuckled and pulled up a chair. He rested his elbows on his knees, studying the night sky. "How was the first day?" Andy exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Fine, I guess." Edward raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound convincing." Andy hesitated before admitting, "It's just different. Everyone there grew up in a different world. A world where they don't have to worry about hospital bills, or whether their dad will make it home exhausted every night." Edward nodded. "Yeah, I remember that feeling." Andy looked at him surprised. "You do?" A small smile played on Edward's lips. "I wasn't always wealthy, you know. I came from nothing. No fancy schools, no connections. Just a kid with a knack for computers and a stubborn streak." Andy sat up straighter, intrigued. "Really?" Edward nodded. "I used to fix old computers from the junkyard, took them apart, learned how they worked. Eventually I started coding, built a small company from scratch. But even when I made my first real money, people still looked at me like I didn't belong." Andy frowned. "Even after you proved yourself?" Edward let out a breath. "Money doesn't erase where you come from, Andy. Some people will always see you as less than, but that's their problem, not yours." Andy stared at his book, the words blurring. "I just don't want to feel like I don't deserve to be there." Edward leaned back. "Let me ask you something. Do you think I deserved your $5 that day on the bus?" Andy blinked. "What? That's different." "Is it?" Edward tilted his head. "You helped me without knowing who I was, without caring about where I came from or what I had. You just did the right thing." Andy swallowed. Edward continued. "That school isn't about where you started, Andy. It's about where you're going. And from what I've seen, you're going places." Andy was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "Thanks, Edward." Edward smirked. "Anytime, kid." The weeks at Brookshire Academy passed quickly. At first, Andy kept his head down, focusing on his work. He still felt the weight of being the scholarship kid, but he refused to let it stop him. And then, something changed. During a coding assignment in his computer science class, he finished ahead of schedule. The teacher, impressed, asked him to explain his approach. That was the moment everything shifted. For the first time, the other students weren't whispering about how he got into the school. They were whispering about how he was actually good at this. Andy felt it too. Numbers, logic, programming. It just made sense. One afternoon, as he sat in the library working on a project, a few students approached him. "Hey," one of them said, shifting awkwardly. "You're really good at this stuff. Mind helping us figure something out?" Andy blinked, caught off guard. Then he nodded. "Yeah, sure." And just like that, things started to change. Back at home, Thomas and Edward had fallen into an unexpected routine. Thomas still had a hard time fully grasping their new reality, a life without back-breaking labor, without fear of unpaid bills. But Edward never made him feel like he owed him anything. Instead, they talked about fatherhood, about sacrifice, about what it meant to build a future. One evening, as Thomas poured them both a cup of coffee, he finally asked the question that had been on his mind. "Why are you still here?" Edward took a sip before answering. "Because Andy isn't just some kid who helped me once. He's family now." Thomas studied him. "And what about you? Do you have family?" Edward hesitated before setting his cup down. Not anymore. There was a weight behind those words, a loneliness Thomas recognized. Thomas nodded slowly. Well, you do now. Edward glanced at him, something unreadable in his expression. Then he smiled. Yeah, I guess I do. Late one night, Andy sat at his desk, sketching an idea in his notebook. Edward knocked on the doorframe. Still awake? Andy didn't look up. Yeah, just thinking. Edward stepped inside. About what? Andy hesitated before flipping his notebook around. On the page was a rough blueprint, a design for a new kind of prosthetic device. Edward's eyebrows lifted. What's this? Andy ran a hand through his hair. I've been thinking a lot about the people I met during therapy. Some of them, they don't have the same chances I got. They can't afford the best doctors or the best recovery programs. Edward's gaze softened. Andy swallowed. I want to build something. Something affordable. Something that helps people walk again. Edward was silent for a moment. Then he smiled. Now that's a damn good dream, kid. Andy grinned. For the first time, he could see it, his future, and this time, he wasn't afraid. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the quiet street outside Brookshire Academy. Andy stepped out of the tall iron gates, adjusting the straps of his backpack, still lost in thought about the coding project he had been working on. He glanced up and saw Edward waiting for him by the sidewalk, leaning casually against a sleek black car. You again? Andy teased, smirking. Edward grinned. I figured you could use a break. Your dad's working late, so I thought we'd go for a walk. Andy nodded. Yeah, okay. They strolled toward the nearby park, the air fresh with the scent of fallen leaves. Children ran across the playground, their laughter ringing out, while joggers passed by with focused determination. Edward nudged Andy playfully. So, how's the scholarship kid holding up? Andy rolled his eyes. Better. I think they've stopped whispering about me. Edward chuckled. Told you. Once people see what you're capable of, they'll stop questioning why you're there. They reached an empty bench near a small pond, the water reflecting the soft hues of the setting sun. Edward sat down first, stretching his legs out in front of him. Andy plopped down beside him, resting his crutches against the side. For a moment, they simply watched the world move around them. Then, Andy turned toward Edward, his brows furrowed slightly. Can I ask you something? Edward glanced at him. Of course. Andy hesitated before speaking. Why did you do all this for me? Edward exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward the pond. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Because, he said finally, you taught me something money can't buy. Andy tilted his head. What do you mean? Edward turned to him, a soft smile playing on his lips. I spent most of my life believing success was about numbers, about profit margins, business deals, stocks. He paused. But when I lost everything that night, when I was nothing but a man begging for help, nobody looked twice. Andy swallowed, remembering the way the passengers had turned away that day on the bus. Edward continued, except you. He met Andy's eyes. You had $5, that was it, and you still chose to help me. You didn't care who I was, what I had, or if I could ever pay you back. You just saw someone who needed kindness. Andy looked down at his hands. He had never thought about it that way. Edward smiled, placing a hand on Andy's shoulder. That's why I'm here. Because kindness is the greatest wealth of all, and you reminded me of that. A lump formed in Andy's throat. He cleared it quickly, nodding. Edward leaned back against the bench. Besides, he added with a smirk, I figured if I stuck around long enough, you might actually turn into someone worth investing in. Andy laughed, nudging Edward with his elbow. I guess we'll see. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Laughter from the playground carried over the breeze, and for a moment, everything felt right. Andy had a future to build. Edward had a family he never expected. And one small act of kindness had changed both of their lives forever. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.